Welcome.
Hang on, Harold. I'm sorry. Travis, you've hit record? Okay, great. Sorry.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Harold Hommel, and I'll be your host for the evening. I'm a member of the Saanich Gulf Islands Greens EDA. This is the 8th in a series of events with our leadership contestants put together by 3 BC EDAs, North Island, Powell River, Kelowna Lake Country, and Saanich Gulf Islands. Let me start by acknowledging that I'm located on and live and work on the unceded territory of the Wasanic peoples and the other indigenous groups of the Salish Sea. So thank you for joining us. I'll go over a few housekeeping issues. The chat is disabled for security reasons. In some previous events with our leadership contestants, there have been racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, and trans-homophobic attacks. Not only is the chat disabled, but we will be removing anyone who is disruptive. Due to COVID-19, this leadership contest has been largely conducted online, so we have to play with the cards we've been dealt. We're doing this session a little differently than the others have been. The leadership contest is winding down, and so we thought we'd give the contestants a chance to really showcase themselves, so to speak. So while we have prepared questions, we're going to give Glen 10 to 15 minutes to tell us about who he is as a leader and how his life experience informs his leadership style. So this is a more unstructured format than we had originally planned, but we think it will give the members a more holistic view of each candidate. Also, we should let you know that all the events will be recorded for posterity and will be available on YouTube and the EDA's Facebook pages. One other thing, Glen, on the previous interviews, we had asked leadership hopefuls if they would like to go over the 1 hour limit that had been originally set for the interview. They agreed and answered questions for about half an hour after the original time. So we'd like to extend that opportunity to you as well. And just to provide full disclosure, and I'm sure Glen doesn't remember this, but Glen and I met once. You were the mayor in Winnipeg and came to speak at the high school I was teaching at. And I was working in the yearbook as well and took some pictures of you. So, I thought it would be really important to let people know. Anyway, okay. So in this first section, Glen will give you a warning when you reach 12 minutes if you go that long. So the floor is yours for the next 10 to 15 minutes. Tell us why you are the person we should choose as our next leader.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you. I've seen a few times now, but thank you for all the efforts and time and energy you're putting into building our party and building our movement. I started off in life as an adopted kid, and I think that was the first thing that really informed my life. By the time I was in my late teens, I was doing a lot of street outreach work in Winnipeg, which is where I'm from, which is the traditional territories of the Cree, Ojibwe, Oji Cree people in Treaty 1 and the homeland of the Métis, which brought me into close contact with what is the largest urban Indigenous population and a very street-involved population. I had, and sort of everything that sort of happened in my life before that sort of positioned me for that. Being adopted, I realized that I was the exception, that most kids who ended up as wards of the state really fell into a perpetual crisis. And that those early days of my life, and then in my early teens, realizing I was gay, having a father who, when he found out, didn't know what to do with me, told me that he couldn't love me if I was gay. So how would other people ever love me? How would I ever make my way in the world? And those were complicated teenage years. I 14 in Montreal, organized a gay and lesbian youth group at the Y, probably the first in Canada. This was in the 1970s when I was in high school. And I was always that kind of person that just went out and got things done. I really tried to look when there were things that weren't happening, there weren't safe places for people. I would go and try to create them. A lot of those early experiences in my teenage years when I started in many years later, well, not that many years, but a decade later in my 20s, when I ended up in Winnipeg, in the middle of the AIDS crisis, I was organizing street outreach programs for street-involved youth, built something called Village Clinic, which was mostly a gay lesbian health center that was unfunded by the government at the time, ran as an entirely volunteer program, and provided almost the entire, just one sec, I've just got someone at my door for some strange reason, being in a hotel. I'll be right back.
So at this point, we usually take a commercial break, but I don't think we have anything ready at the moment. You're unmuted, Glenn.
But that sort of set me off in a life of my teenage years, and then in my 20s, I ended up in a very different kind of world. When I was 20, AIDS was not a word. By the time I turned 30, 43 of my friends have died of AIDS. I had after my university studies in Montreal in urban studies, gotten a job with Canada Post Corporation which was a really interesting job around philatelic programs and stamps and communications. Had a really homophobic boss who phoned my landlord one afternoon on my way home from work. I found out I'd been kicked out of my apartment for being gay, and found all my furniture in the pouring rain on the front lawn of the apartment building I lived in. Much of my late teens and early 20s were dealing with police who beat the crap out of you for being gay. And so I grew up with this sort of sense of a great deal of discrimination, but also this great sense of liberation in my teens and early 20s about being gay, and a time when the revolution was on and I was on the front lines of it. And then when the AIDS epidemic hit, it killed 43 of my friends. 2 of my boyfriends died in my arms. I quit my job at the post office, built Village Clinic, worked with the Indigenous community. Village Clinic became 9 Circles Community Health Center. And I really realized that my life was fragile and resilient at the same time, that most of my friends who were dying were previously very young, healthy people, and I confronted my own mortality. And the AIDS epidemic and the human rights revolution that I was part of leading up to it left me with this idea that life is short and fragile, and you have to live your life for the people you love and the things you hope for. You can't live your life for the things you are afraid of and the people you fear. And so I started my own environmental consulting firm. I was very active in the Winnipeg community, where I had relocated to because of the homophobia that I experienced in Ottawa. Ran for city council, got elected, and launched into a municipal career that led to major initiatives in affordable housing and major work on the New Deal for Cities. Met Jane Jacobs, started doing a lot of work around sustainability, zero waste policies, and then ran for mayor after 3 terms on council, and started putting together the New Deal for Cities, the 5-cent-a-liter gas tax transfer to municipalities, and really the transformation at that time with where the city's agenda really became front and foremost in that. That echoed back, I'm trying to fit things together by sort of subject. I started my political career in Montreal with the Rassemblement des Citoyens et Citoyennes de Montréal. I was very involved in the original formation of what was one of the most successful municipal organizations before I moved to Ottawa and when I was in university. And so that just continued. And also with the Association Nationale des Étudiants du Québec. So at almost every intersection of my life up until my 30s, becoming mayor, I had been involved in pretty revolutionary change in municipal governance and sustainable development, advancing rapid transit, zero waste policies. And then we got into a period of time where I was invited to University of Toronto, set up the city center there, wrote for the Toronto Star, worked with David Crombie and Jane Jacobs, became the CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, started working again on climate change issues, was appointed chair of the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, advising Prime Ministers Martin and Harper on environmental issues. I was appointed by Premiers McGuinty on setting up their smart growth initiatives, rewrote the City of Toronto Act for the provincial government, and chaired their climate change initiatives, which introduced the closure of coal plants in Ontario. That eventually led me back to the private sector, doing a lot of work with clean tech companies, which I'm doing again now at this point in my life. And then an invitation to run as a candidate in Toronto Centre. And I got elected as an MPP, held numerous portfolios, transportation and infrastructure simultaneously, training colleges, universities, research and innovation. Environment and climate change, built the largest carbon pricing system in the world and the most successful, with California and Quebec, reduced emissions by 20%, built the first circular economy legislation in the Americas, which still is intact, and it requires companies to be responsible for the end life of their products, and delivers Ontario over the next 20 years as the first zero waste jurisdiction. That has actually survived, amazingly, the change in government. I have an Indigenous name, Ishkanishkan, from 30 years of working with First Nations communities, which is something I could sort of talk about at almost every point in my life from the time I was a teenager. That means one who gathers people together, which means leadership. I've worked with establishing some of the first urban reserves and land treaty entitlement land agreements in Winnipeg, where First Nations exercise sovereignty in an urban environment, right through to Grassy Narrows in Ontario, which transferred funds and the autonomy to the First Nations to finally clean up a 50-year-old severe mercury contamination site. And so that's been another theme of my life. So the urban policy thing. I've worked internationally with David Hotel and Matt Rodriguez. We put together much at the Lima COP before Paris of what became the foundation for the Paris Agreement, and played a major role in that. I have a very large, complex life, but that's not really what I want to kind of talk to you about. I got back into politics after my partner of 26 years, who's hardly seen me, said that the climate change crisis was so severe and spinning out of control in Canada, emissions were going up, that I had to get back into politics, because he just didn't see too many people around who would be able to deliver the kinds of reductions, partnerships with business and others that were necessary. And I have grandchildren, and they're not going to live to my age on the path we're on. The destruction of our oceans, our forests, are happening all so quickly. And we have a government in Canada that's overseeing some of the most rapid increasing emissions. There is not a part of the country right now that is where emissions aren't going up. And you know, they were in Quebec and Ontario and California going down faster than almost anywhere else in the world. And I remember how we did that. I worked with business. I worked with Jerry Dias at Unifor and industry leaders. And with Jerry, and working with labor and industry, we got them to commit to a 4.3% reduction, which if annually in greenhouse gas emissions. To understand how important that was, had Ontario stuck with that after the first 4 years of it, we would exceed the 60% reduction the Green Party is committed to. So up until a year ago, Ontario, which now is a net emitter, was actually on a track that would reduce emissions. But the Green Party that I've joined is not the Green Party that I see emerging right now. I'm just going to be totally blunt with you, because I've been wandering around. I've had a lot of trouble talking to you today because I'm actually pretty upset. I think most of the stuff we stand for is under attack by some of the other leadership candidates. And I think you have a very stark decision to make. We are a big tent party. We don't brand ourselves as socialists or capitalists. We welcome Gord Miller, and former conservative, and Mike Schreiner, and Jim Harris, and we welcome Murray Madad and Dimitri Lascaris, and a whole bunch of folks of diverse views. We don't care whether guaranteed livable income was an idea of Hugh Segal, who was a conservative senator, or something that was supported by Jack Layton, or whether greenhouse gas emissions reductions of 60% are a right-wing or a left-wing idea. We are a party that is about ideas. In an age of labels and polarizing politics, we're one of the only parties where people from all different perspectives can come together and support each other and find common ground. We actually draw on that range. Our big difference with other parties is that we believe in a circular economy, not a linear economy. We're the only party in Canada that actually thinks that we should be designing things to be durable and not for the dump. That we can make all of the aluminum we need from our economy out of recovered aluminum. That the 4 steel mills in this country that have survived and are all running on completely recovered resources, and the 3 that are bankrupt or in trusteeship are running on virgin resources. That's the party I joined, because we don't have a political purity test. So I'll be really blunt. If Dimitri Lascaris is leader of the party, it'll shatter the party. You cannot attack Jerry Dias and Unifor. The union that is the largest union in the country represents people who are in vulnerable situations in the oil sands, in the gas sector, in transportation, ironically in clean energy and clean technology, openly in a debate. When I talk to Jerry and people in Unifor, and alienate them and say that they have no place in the party, and you have eco-socialists who think that credible labor leaders, we would not have the reductions in Canada if it wasn't for Jerry Dias and Unifor. They led the fight for just transition. They worked with environmental defense to create the blue-green coalition between environmental and labor groups. And the Green Party I joined welcomed labor. The clean sector. We have candidates that want to dismantle capitalism in the next 10 years. Well, I'm sorry, I don't have time to dismantle global capitalism. And yes, I think carbon budgets and carbon pricing systems are sufficient. My experience with industry that signed on to 4.3% reductions is not to kick them in the head, attack them, and tell them that we're going to introduce legislation, as Dimitri does, that's going to restructure their boards and force board restructuring. While we're declaring war on business and war on label, we are going to become absolutely irrelevant. And I'm in Vancouver, and I spoke to clean tech companies, and they're totally aware of this. They're listening to this, and they're hearing absolute crickets from most of the leaders. Well, we have people who fly an eco-socialist banner and can't even tell you what it means. I'm all for lifting 6 million people out of poverty, but I actually wrote a policy paper that shows how you do it within a balanced budget, which taxes you would raise and how you do it. So don't tell me I don't care about poor people or that I'm not that politically correct, because none of those leaders have candidates have an actual realistic place to go. And if you think we're going to elect people in Manitoba and in most of the country on that kind of eco-socialist banal rhetoric, and we're going to attack the clean tech sector, and we're going to attack unions that are naturally aligned with us, then I'm sorry, then we're done. We're going to be done as a party. And the fact that this goes on and no one challenges it is problematic. And I can tell you, because we're doing polling, you got to, I mean, I'm in one of the top spots. Adam A's in the top spot, and Dimitri's in the top spot. And we either are a big tent party that invites open debate and includes everybody, and welcomes a Jim Harris and a Gord Miller who completely and passionately agree with the priorities, or we're going to have this political litmus test, and we're going to attack people who are natural allies. You know, and I just absolutely have to tell you, I'm beside myself with the ridiculousness of what's going on in the party right now. And I'm not prepared to give up the Green Party. We need a guaranteed livable income. 1 in 3 Canadians actively want to vote for us. The vast majority of those do not self-describe as eco-socialists. They don't even know it. The people who seem to talk about it don't even seem to know what it means. But we need to be a party that is interested in the people that are interested in us. We're built on 6 global green values. We believe in electoral reform. We believe in a circular economy. That differentiates us from every other party. And you know, if I think the entire future of our party is on the line in that ballot. And I'm not alone in that. Other people, you know, if you actually have your ear to the ground in the party, there are lots of folks who are really, really concerned about exactly where we're going to land. Because
Okay.
try to run on that kind of ideology in most of the country and we're done. You're not going to get votes. We're not going to get votes.
Glenn.
And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. On that passionate note, I'm going to step in for a sec. That was quite a list of initiatives that you've been involved in to this point. We want to open up the chat for questions from the attendees, but we do have some questions to, you know, that we've prepared, so that we're not going to run out of any questions or sit there with dead air time, I can tell. So let's move on. Got a question that I was thinking about, and I was looking at this because of what you were talking about in terms of all the people involved and the big tent idea behind the Green Party. You know, in light of the current fiscal deficit spawned by COVID-19, what are your priorities for a realistic socioeconomic recovery plan?
Well, right now we're spending $720 billion a year. That's what the budget says. And we take in $340 billion a year. And so that's not sustainable. There are some people who are running who are going to tell you, and they are telling you, that it doesn't matter. There's a new economic theory. I'm sorry, I've been in government. I'm the only one who's ever held elected office. I'm the only one who's ever run and won elections. I've sat at a cabinet table. I've been a mayor of a large city that had the largest per capita debt in the country. So I know what it's like to stare across the table at bankers and financiers and be told by smart 27-year-olds with MBAs exactly what the restrictions are on your government's ability to spend money. And if you want to know, just ask Bob Ray what he went through and how much power a province can lose because your debt is held by people who can put rules in place if your debt gets out of control. So we as a province, as a country, and as a party, said that we want to lift people out of poverty. We proposed quite correctly what now is flavor of the month with the Liberals, a guaranteed livable income. And I went through that. So I said, so how do you do that constitutionally? Because social services, post-secondary education, constitutionally are all our provincial responsibilities. So if you go to the website, you'll see a policy paper called End Poverty Now. And it's one program with 5 streams. I'll tell you how we pay for it first. There's something called fiscal expenditures. They're a large area of federal government spending that people don't often look at. And the difference between a fiscal expenditure and a regular expenditure is a health transfer to British Columbia by the federal government to help with health care under the Medicare Act. A regular expenditure is buying aircraft for the Canadian Armed Forces. A fiscal expenditure is the funding for any tax incentive. So when people can write off their meals and their drinks as a business expense, the government has to budget for that, though it isn't writing a direct check, it has to budget for the tax write-off. So there's $197 billion of what are called fiscal expenditures. What we did, and I and the 2 people I collaborated, we took $87 billion of that and we turned it into something called the refundable tax credit. So if you're a student and you only make $10,000, that means you pay $1,500 in taxes, which means that any tax credit you get is capped at $1,500. Unless it's a refundable tax credit, which means that it doesn't matter how much you paid in taxes, you get the full amount as a grant. So we introduced the student benefit program, which gives students $9,240 in a refundable tax credit. So if you're a student and you make $10,000, you get another $9,240 as a grant. If you're a senior, which is the other group, 1/3 of seniors live in pretty destitute poverty, every single senior will get a $7,200 increase based on their pension, which is the easiest one because it's federal. The same thing with childcare, which is another commitment that we made as a party. Every family with preschool aged kids would get $500 per month as a direct childcare benefit, which in most provinces, especially Quebec and Ontario and BC, where there are existing childcare benefits, that would close the gap between early childhood education and childcare. There's a disability credit, and the other big one is the employment benefit credit for the working benefit credit, which raises all of the lower income workers in Canada by 25%. So if you're a personal support worker or an entry-level clerk at a Costco or a Safeway or a Loblaws, you get that benefit increase. It's $4,800. That raises almost all 6 million Canadians who are in poverty out of poverty. And it's paid for 93% by redirecting about 40% of the fiscal expenditures budget that is currently used for corporate and tax write-off for the wealthy, and makes those available as refundable tax credits. The balance of it comes from a 5% increase on incomes of over $250,000 and a 7% increase in bank rate corporate taxes, which brings the tax rate on Canadian banks to the same level of the US, which means that those tax increases will be intact because there's absolutely no incentive for anyone to relocate to the United States or offshore their entire tax revenue, because we're still competitive, but we're generating many billions of dollars in additional revenue. And that is written on a 90-page document on my website in a way that it could be walked into Chrystia Freeland's office tomorrow and put into the budget. It fulfills just about every single Green Party commitment that we have made as part of a guaranteed livable income. And if Jason Kenney and Doug Ford decided they didn't want to support it, there's nothing they could do to stop it constitutionally or legally. And that's the kind of thing that we need to do as a party. You know, my Aunt Ethel, and I actually have one, can look right now and see what her income is right now, and then see what it would be after, and that's how you do it. And I mean, this is the kind of stuff I did when I was mayor of Winnipeg. It's the kind of stuff we did with tuition when we put basically free tuition for all families under $80,000 in Ontario. There's all of these tools that exist within government that we don't often use, but the right wing uses it pretty well because corporations use it pretty well. And these are the kinds of things that I don't care whether you identify as left or right of center green. These are things that all of us can support, and we should be running on ideas, not on ideological banners. And for me, this was an exact way in which we could do it. Like, why do we want to have gatekeepers in our party and political tests? I just don't understand this. I really don't.
Okay. I think you hit on some of the things there. Specifically with COVID-19, there were a number of groups that were hit, and certainly students. You mentioned students, working families, that kind of thing. I guess the other group that is often hit, especially because they're in the service industry, was women. You didn't mention anything having to do with that. Do you want to add to that at all? Or?
Oh, well, it's been a she session. One of the biggest barriers to women getting back into the workforce is childcare.
Yeah.
We've been promising a national childcare program. No one can figure out how to fund it. If you read the End Poverty Now, it is the first national coast to coast childcare program paid entirely by the federal government. The other thing that the End Poverty Now, because when you do the approach that I'm suggesting that we take as the Green Party, which is changing the federal tax code, you change provincial revenues. So what I'm proposing actually adds $18 billion to the to provincial revenues. Because you don't just change the revenues of the federal government, you actually change the revenues of the provinces. So provincial revenues under this plan would go up $18 billion, which would allow the federal government and the federal Green Party, if this proposal is accepted, it would allow us to say to the provinces, look, we're taking the heat for the tax increases. We're also giving you $18 billion more capacity. And I would suggest that you put that into childcare, you put that into early childhood education. Because the barriers that most women experience is their responsibility for childcare and for the additional costs of having still sadly today a disproportionately larger responsibility for children in most families than men do, as much as we think we are past those things. And that there are so many single parent families that are disproportionately headed by women that we really have to pay attention to that. So it's the only proposal I can think of that I have seen that has come forward. And the other group of women are seniors. Most of our senior citizens that are living in poverty are overwhelmingly women. So increasing their income by 25 to 30% in this proposal raises one of the largest groups of women out of poverty, and that's seniors. So it affects women who have childcare, who are sort of facing childcare needs as part of the challenge and barriers to returning to their jobs. And it deals with effectively with supporting more elderly women who are trapped on low incomes in retirement.
Well, that sounds fairly extensive. Let's go to the questions. I see that Helena has a question ready from one of our participants. Helena, go ahead.
So this question comes from Linda Brown and relates to the climate emergency. Linda asks, we are in a climate emergency. What are your 3 to 5 top priorities for the federal government to address it, the ones that can have the most rapid or large impacts? Thank you.
So on my website, glenmurray.ca, there are a series of policy discussion papers. There's one on climate action that includes carbon pricing. We are past the point where incrementalism is going to work. We have to be at a 60% reduction by 2030. And if we're going to get to zero, and we're going to have to get there significantly before 2050, but even if we wanted to get there by 2050, by 2030, we just can't have a whole bunch of more fuel efficient internal combustion engine cars on the road. To actually, because you could achieve a 2030 target of 40, 50, 60%, but do it in a way that makes achieving climate neutrality and eventually, more importantly, climate stability impossible. So the mix of technology on the roads for trucks and vehicles, for example, which is over 1/3 of all of our emissions, has to mean that by 2030, most vehicles are some sort of electric, non-polluting technology platform. So the federal carbon tax has been a complete failure. Emissions went up by 15 megatons. The effective program in Ontario was eviscerated. The government in Quebec has stalled the Quebec program. The only jurisdiction left in North America that's achieving significant reductions is California, which still carries on a system that has a carbon budget. And literally California is one of the only jurisdictions in North America left that has actually legislated the limitations on how much carbon pollution. So right now we would have to legislate a carbon budget that would reduce by 9% per year to meet the target that we as a party have. That isn't going to just be by disincenting or putting additional prices on. You absolutely need a carbon pricing system. Whether it's a tax or a cap and trade system, I think is less important because they can look the same depending on how you design them. The design is in the details. Having carbon budgets and legislated caps and abilities to pool capital to accelerate on the model the World Bank has outlined to accelerate capital formulation for industry to decarbonize. There are some good examples of that in the world. I think the Ontario-Quebec one worked. Norway has an excellent one. New Zealand has an excellent one, and those are all under different pricing systems. I totally believe in fee and dividend, which is a Green Party policy. We absolutely need that. That deals with social equity issues. It's totally compatible. But we need technology a mandate. So we have to actually say that within so many years, we are going to phase out the internal combustion engine and replace it with electric motors. We're going to have to say that fossil fuels in buildings are going to have to be mandated and phased out. It's much what we did in the Second World War when we literally had no navy or military complex or resources to fight the Nazi regime, and we mandated the construction of a merchant marine, and in 4 years built the third largest navy in the world. We built more tanks and more aircraft for the British Battle of the Atlantic and defense of London from the Nazi bombers than any other country. And I've often used that example as what we have to do. We are simply going to have to work and start to mandate with industry and with labor as partners that we do a technology shift, because we simply cannot achieve carbon neutrality in time on an incremental system. And that's starting to emerge in Germany right now. It's actually interesting, the collaboration between the auto sector in Germany and the German government and Angela Merkel, particularly when the Greens were coalition partners, was they got BMW and Volkswagen and Audi to agree that almost all of the vehicles that they will be selling by the mid-2020s will be non-polluting vehicles. So I think we should adopt the German model of mandates to reduce, and those are the kinds of things that we do. The bottom line is, government is, where I disagree with some of the other candidates on the left, and I would say the sort of far left, is that you can't do this without industry. Had it not been for Jerry Dias, we would not have been able to negotiate with industry a 4.3% reduction in the heavy industrial sector. You need to build relationships with labor and industry, which I have done nationally and internationally. And we as a Green Party, anyone who thinks that government can act unilaterally over labor, civil society, and business to achieve dramatic social and economic reform is smoking something. And when you listen to people who want to restructure and have the government of Canada restructure corporate boards, well, great, but you're not going to affect Walmart or Exxon, who have international boards, but you certainly will create a completely devastating blow to the perception that people have of the Green Party as someone who can work effectively as a change agent within the economy.
Great, Glenn. I just wanted to check. Mandates are not something that's that unusual, right? You mentioned Germany, but there's other countries that are putting in mandates for certain types of things by a certain date, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Quebec had a zero emissions mandate, and it had requirements for the percentages of number of cars that had to be sold. This is not radical. This is going to, I mean, you could, the sad reality is today, you can count the number of countries that are really seriously bringing down emissions and around the world right now that are even close to the Paris Agreement on two hands. I mean, in the G20 countries, Canada is tied with South Korea, 20 out of 20, 19 and 20, for having the worst record on meeting our Paris Agreement commitments. The United States under Donald Trump has gone completely off the rails. China is building more coal plants in adjacent countries than they ever have before. Russia is in a free fall on its commitments. Britain is absolutely enveloped in post-Brexit craziness. And the European Union system is at best stabilizing emissions in some countries, but the majority of countries are seeing emissions going up. And the climate crisis is getting worse. And Canada is one of the only countries, maybe Norway, maybe Sweden, maybe New Zealand, but we are a handful of countries that can actually achieve reductions now, that have a political culture, stability, reasonably responsible business and labor leadership that will work with government that can actually get to a 60% reduction by 2030, which means it's even more important that we do it, because then we have to start a global leadership role and start to influence our allies. You know, in the same way that Quebec, California, and Ontario formed a carbon club to work together, they make up the fourth largest economy in the world, all embedded within North America. So the purchasing power of the public and private sector in those three jurisdictions is almost half of the North American economy. So it disproportionately influences that. So I think our international policy has to be that Canada takes the lead from that and forms international partnerships that actually are big enough economies but small enough clubs that they set the standard, because California's environmental standards for vehicles are the US standard, because California is big enough that it doesn't matter what the other states say the CAFE or car emission standards are. Whatever California sets is the national standard in the United States. And so we have to realize that Canada, with really strategic partnerships, can start to set international standards, but we have to work internationally. And I don't think we are right now. I think our entire national carbon pricing and carbon strategy is done in complete isolation. The fact that the Canadian government did not continue to engage with California when the Quebec-California coalition was broken up was a tragedy. California's economy is larger than Canada's, and there was a natural desire there from Governor Brown to re-engage with the Canadian government, and we didn't. So,
Okay, Glenn, I'm going to cut you off there at that point. Travis, are you ready with a question?
I am. Hi, Glenn. Thanks for coming.
thanks.
Got a lot of good questions here. I'm just going to pick, not in a series of sequence, just to keep it interesting. We can float around through the list here. But I got one from Jim Hesser, and it says, wild salmon stocks on our coast have been steadily declining. What approaches do you favor for addressing this situation?
Well, on a number of levels. One, we have to have a major natural restoration, ecosystem restoration strategy. The challenge that we have is that our winters within the next 20 or 30 years in Canada are going to be 8 degrees Celsius warmer. That will be the mean temperature. That is going to have a devastating impact on ocean, freshwater, and forest-based ecosystems. And that is going to have huge consequences for fish populations, bird populations. We're going to see massive tree losses because we're now getting warm enough that all kinds of invasive water, aquatic and land-based species. So I would just say it's terrible. We need to massively invest in the salmon fishery and in the salmon and in the more complex ecological systems around salmon in both the saltwater and freshwater parts of their lives. We actually need to have what we don't have right now, which is a national ecological restoration strategy. But I would simply say that, even if you did all of that and you had species and ecosystem specific restoration programs, as important as they are, if the background tragedy of climate change is not reversed, that 8 degrees Celsius mean temperature increase in the next couple of decades in northern Canadian ecosystems would completely undermine any restoration program. I mean, you saw Australia lose almost a quarter of its forest in a fire. The boreal forest has been a carbon source, a net carbon source, not a net carbon sink since 2006. The acidification and plastics in our oceans overwhelm a lot of the species-specific solutions we have. And I started scuba diving a couple of years ago and went down with a marine biologist from Woods Hole, just to see that in the Mesoamerican reef where I was, in 5 years, 50% of the visited sites by scuba divers in the Mesoamerican reef, which is the incubator of life in much of the Caribbean and Atlantic, had died. And that was a 1 degree Celsius change in temperature in certain currents. So we are seeing the massive collapse of our most significant ecosystems, driven largely by climate change or the intersection of climate change and other programs. So I believe that alongside our climate change strategy, we need general ecosystem restoration in both land and aquatic ecosystems, and we need species-specific survival strategies. But I would just underline by saying that they only are going to be effective in the long term if they have an intersection with an aggressive program to halt devastating climate change.
Okay, thank you, Glenn.
Okay, great.
I'm just going to go turn a light on here because I just realized I'm looking like a dark shadow. So just one sec. I'm not sure that any of that did any good, but tried.
Oh, well, what can you do? So you've said that we should be able to win 50 seats in the next 2 elections. How do we do that, Glenn?
By listening to people. Our general policy base is pretty strong. So consistent and clear messaging, realizing that people live right on time lives. Most of the people I talk to in Toronto, in Winnipeg, quand je retourne à Montréal, parce que je suis né à Montréal, je passe ma jeunesse à Montréal. They really like what we're talking about. They totally get guaranteed livable income. They totally get that they don't want students drowning in debt. They totally get ecological restoration. They totally understand the transformation to a circular economy, that means repatriating jobs and you know, retrofitting homes, we have enough aluminum waste and recycled aluminum in the recycling system in Eastern Canada to run the entire Rio Tinto smelter in Quebec 100% on recovered materials forever, because aluminum is perpetually reprocessable. We don't have to mine bauxite in Jamaica. We do it with 80 to 85% less energy, and the material input costs would be a small fraction, 15 to 20% as well. That means that we would produce the highest quality, lowest cost aluminum in the world, and we'd have way more money for jobs in that. The same thing I mentioned steel before. We can make plastics out of plastics. Going to a completely circular recovered economy would be a clear message, but we have to articulate why a circular economy isn't just great environmental policy, why it's great for our quality of life, for better jobs, more jobs, higher per capita GDP, low levels of unemployment, more efficient economy, I've said we should pick the 50 seats that we could most win, strengthen all of our EDAs, because all of them should have a development plan for their future, but concentrate on the 50 that we have the highest probability of winning. And, you know, when I was in Prince Edward Island, people told me, like, you know, Darcy Lanfey and people, Malapec is a seat we almost won. We were actually ahead. We know the other seats around Moncton that we can pick up in New Brunswick. And Winnipeg South Centre is a seat that if I ran in, I think we would have a very, very good chance of winning. Kitchener Centre and Guelph. I mean, Karen Farbridge, who's a friend of mine, who's the mayor in Guelph. But, you know, I did this plan that's on the website called 15 Steps to 50 Seats, and that's the approach I would take. You can go read it. It talks about nominating candidates right away, giving them 6, 12, 18 months to become basically the shadow local MP and to engage, that the leader should concentrate in those 50 seats. The whole plan is laid out there, and you know, whether I'm leader or not, I would strongly encourage whoever is the leader to take that kind of approach. You know, we can't keep spreading the peanut butter too thin over the whole country. And, you know, the last election we were doing really well until we got into debates on Quebec sovereignty, whipping our vote, and abortion. We've really got to show message discipline. People understand that. You know, like the biggest debate and the leaders' debate has been, you know, boycott and disinvest in Israel, and it comes up all the time. There are all kinds of regional and important issues of that one. The Uyghurs, the Rohingya, the Russian annex of Ukraine. We could get involved in all kinds of those things, and they all should be part of a coherent green foreign policy. But to use an issue like that, which is highly politically divisive in an election campaign or in a leadership race, doesn't connect or live in the middle of the reality of Canadians who are struggling with jobs, women who have been pushed out of the economy, seniors who are struggling and worrying about their economic security, students drowning in debt, people experiencing racism and marginalization, and address our concerns about a rapidly declining ecology on this planet and the destruction of our oceans and the natural systems on which we depend. Those are the things that the Green Party is expected to lead on by Canadians and center. So I know it might be politically indelicate, but look at what the priorities of the candidates are. Do you want a candidate who builds bridges, brings labor and business, civil society, community, a party for which there is lots of room for eco-capitalists and eco-socialists, and we share ideas rather than slap labels on each other. I really think that is your choice. And so, yeah, that's how we do it. But I got to tell you, I mean, think about knocking on doors in the next election and ask what kind of messaging you want. Why are we not talking about Indigenous people, sovereignty and expressions of sovereignty in urban environments, as much as we're talking about more narrow foreign policy issues? I wish we had spent as much time talking about land treaty entitlement in Canada and First Nations exercising sovereign rights to create their own economy in our cities as we have on some narrow foreign policy issues. But why are people doing that? Because there's a political constituency for those people in it. And the mainstream of the Green Party has to stand up and claim what is our center, what are our central ideas. Why do Canadians want a Green Party? Why did I join the Green Party? Why are so many people feeling abandoned by the Liberals, completely confused and angry at the Conservatives, and see the NDP in provincial governments jacking up emissions higher than some of the Conservative governments are? Like, we have a place in this country, and we have a place in politics, and we don't have to play in what I think are cynical political correctness games to win the public's confidence.
Okay, super. Helena, are you ready with a question?
Yes, there was a question from Susan Watt that said, Glenn, can you please speak to your tweet regarding Ibrahim Hamidi, the 19-year-old Iranian man who may be executed for being gay in Iran? How is it that no one in the Canadian government or other Green Party leadership candidates who constantly talk about social justice in Israel are not even mentioning? Thank you.
Well, I'm aware of that because an organization I founded in my living room called Rainbow Railroad in 2006 was created. It's literally like the Underground Railroad that Harriet Tubman started. So we set up safe houses in Iran, just as in Moscow. Well, actually, we set up the safe houses in Turkey, in Van, Turkey, in Moscow. It was an organization that was founded by Irshad Manji, Michelle Douglas, Murray Newman, and myself. You can guess our racial and religious affiliations are quite diverse by those names. We founded it in Jerusalem, and we founded it working with Palestinian and Israeli gay and lesbian organizations because so many young Palestinian men were being killed in honor killings. And we came back to Canada. We ran it for 6 years out of my living room. We worked in Jamaica, Uganda, Chechnya, where 300 we've got 300 gay, lesbian, transgender Canadians out of there. The operation in Van, Turkey, is under attack right now because the government in Turkey has become more extremist and anti-gay. But we ran a railroad that got people out of Iran. So the case you're talking about, and we brought lots of constables from the Jamaica Constabulary because of the anti-gay violence in Jamaica was directed at outed police officers. So there are about 80 countries where there are very, very, very serious consequences for being outed. I mean, in Uganda, there's a law that if you're the friend of a gay person and you don't report them to the police, you do 7 years in prison. Chechnya, you're rounded up and killed. So I spent a lot of my life doing that. I think it's a good model. But I don't know why others aren't. I don't know why when I resigned from the Friends of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, why, because there was complete harassment of Black and Indigenous staff on the staff of one of our largest museums, for example, where Black and Indigenous people had to quit, where gay displays were hidden and removed when socially conservative people complained, and when women complained about sexual harassment. The federal minister just said that they shouldn't do those things, and none of the other candidates who have been claiming that Black Lives Matter even spoke up about one of the most important things. I am now working with minority communities to try and rebuild the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which is one of our largest federal museums. So yeah, no, I mean, this is the reality for me in this party, and I come from a minority. Like, where are we on these issues? Why in our own institutions, when people who claim that these issues are important sit silently in debate? Why, when candidates for leader viciously attack a labor leader who represents the people who work in the most precarious sunset industries, is no one in our party leadership speaking out? And I talk to leadership at Unifor and they're bewildered. They say, like, even the conservatives don't treat us this badly. You know, like, we have a problem. And I came into this party because I think the Greens want to transform the economy, and they want to do it with respected labor leaders. They want the Tom Rands and the Toby Heaps from Corporate Knights, who are brilliant, internationally recognized green investors and innovators. You know, Chief Ava Hill, my friend Heather Manley, who you know, who's on this call, who was I met as a police officer for 25 years in Ontario, who is becoming a lawyer, who comes from Paul Manley, and Heather's family is long that. Like, why are we not listening to these people? You know, we're all talking about these things about BIPOC, and I mean, we have on this call right now one woman who served as a police officer for 25 years in Ontario, is an Indigenous woman who lives in the middle of all of this, and we're not listening to these voices. I know more about, you know, like, and people who claim these things. We have to be relevant to the Canadian conversation. Like, and, you know, right now I can tell you, because probably, you know, I got people said, well, who's doing the poll? That IVR poll, that was my campaign. We polled all 15,000 and we said, because I wanted to know, because quite frankly, if I was trailing right now, and one of the other candidates, like, I love Courtney, I love we have amazing candidates who shared my philosophical view, I would get right behind that candidate. I'm less interested in being leader of this party than our party being successful in the election. Like, this isn't about us as candidates. We have a global crisis. We have a human rights crisis. We have a crisis with disrespect, marginalization, systemic racism, and cultural genocide with Indigenous people. And I'm tired of the politically correct rhetoric. Who's actually ever done anything about that? Who's ever taken on Grassy Narrows? I lived through NDP, Liberal, and Conservative governments who abandoned the people of Grassy Narrows. 10 tons of mercury dumped in. People dying. Failure to do that. Governments in Ontario indemnifying themselves so they can't be sued by the Indigenous community. And when I become minister, I take it on, and I'm staring down my own bureaucrats because they've become so complicit in it over the years, trying to explain why politicians are failing to meet the basic needs that people don't have to die of mercury poisoning and can't sue. Like, let's get real. Let's get real. I'm sorry, you want a leader who's built international carbon partnerships, who brings business and labor to the party? You want someone who's got an Indigenous name, who works seamlessly and is respected by Indigenous people, a mayor who was elected 5 times as chair of the Big City Mayor's Caucus, who's won 8 elections in 2 different provinces, who represented in Toronto Centre, where some of the other candidates come from, one with some of the largest pluralities, and is well respected and worked with racialized minorities and a large Muslim community in downtown Toronto, and busted my butt for 8 years, who works 90 hours a week. And we're into identity politics right now. People need change. We don't need more politically correct rhetoric. We need a guaranteed livable income program that we can afford and the federal government can implement. We need serious people to lead this party. We've got 8 years because it's going to take us a long time to set up the machinery that we have in our program to achieve a 60% reduction. We're not going to do it 3 months from now, and we're not going to do it with 3 seats. We're going to need 50 seats, and we're going to need a few years. So ask yourself who's going to do that. Because right now, you know, we're heading to become an eco-socialist party that no one really knows what it means, except it's really good at alienating people.
Wow, that was most interesting, Glenn. Boy, do you need a break for a moment?
No, this is, I know I'm 62. I'm 62 years old. I need to be very, very fair. I'm 62 years old. For the next 10 years of my life, I want to change the trajectory on. I have grandkids. I want them to live to 60. I don't want to fool around anymore. This is serious. This is serious. And listen to the debates. Have you been watching the leadership debates? Are you happy with the content of those debates? If you're an Indigenous person, if you're a woman who's trying to figure out how to get their kids back into proper child care and get economic security for their family, If you're someone who understands how serious the climate change crisis is, are you hearing the kinds of things you need to hear that are going to address the scale and scope of it? Does this sound like the Green Party you want? Does it sound like the one I want?
Thank you. Travis, are you ready with a question at all?
Yes, thank you very much for your passion, Glenn. Your moving words, I appreciate them. I have one from Ganilla Axwick, and it says, what would you do to promote a plant-based diet considering how detrimental animal agriculture is to our already fragile environment?
The same way I try to deal with transportation, practice what I preach. I'm 62 years old. I live in Winnipeg. I ride a bicycle 12 months a year. People laugh at me. If a 62-year-old chubby white guy can ride a bicycle to work in 40-degree below weather in February, well, kids, you can all do it. And it's comfortable, it's warmer than walking, it's more pleasant than being in a car or a bus, and I get there. So chubby middle-aged guy here just joined PETA and bought the Vegan Diet book. My friends are teasing because I'm generally a good cook, but I come from a Ukrainian tradition where vegetarian is what my baba and my mom taught me, which Ukrainian vegetarian involves 3 ingredients: flour, butter, and potatoes generally, and on a good day, cabbage leaves. And so I am struggling with my cultural roots around that. But I'm like, literally, I am in the process of completely eliminating meat in stages from my life. And it's hard. It's hard for someone who had a meat and potato Scottish father and an Eastern European mother who have heavily meat-dependent diets to do that. So I think we all have to do that. I mean, I think it's so clear right now that animal agriculture is not good for our health as the dominant part of the diet it is. And it is such a large part and one of the fastest growing sources of emissions in the world that we all have to do that. But I also believe you can't be, there's 2 things I believe about being a politician that I've always lived by. One is practice what you preach. I really need to try, as someone who grew up in a meat-based diet, in a meat-based family, deep in generations of cultural tradition, moving to a low meat or no meat diet is not easy. But I'm gonna try to do it, because if I'm gonna ask other people to do it, it's completely hypocritical if I'm not doing it myself. For the same reason I don't own an SUV or a car. The second thing is when you make laws, and when folks like you elect folks like me or one of yourselves to elected office, part of the problem with the world right now is politicians have to live in the middle of the law. Part of the problem with the Trudeau government is that people think they can live on the edge of the law. It's technically correct that we didn't exactly break the law with we. But that's not our jobs. Our moral standard as politicians, if you're one of 300 odd people who makes laws for 36 million people, you better darn make sure you're living in the spirit in the middle of the law, because your standard on you is higher. And I think that's the same thing for environmentalists. If we're going to tell people that internal combustion engines are not the way to go, then make sure you can construct your life and realize that maybe mom with 3 kids, daycare, Boy Scouts, and God knows what else, just has to manage the minivan and not be so judgmental, that there are different lifestyles. So someone like me can afford to live without a car and a bicycle, darn well should, because there are other people who have complicated lives and bigger families who have to make different choices. But it's a little bit about more empathy and practicing what you preach. So yes, I would, but I think it's social change, but it's also personal change.
Awesome, thank you, Ben.
You answered another question that I was going to ask, so very good. I was going to ask you about what you do to reduce your carbon footprint, but you've covered that already. So
yeah. It's my carbohydrate footprint I'm worried about right now.
Okay, good. Helena, are you ready with a question?
Yeah,
Maybe.
sorry.
Good.
Okay, so this question is from, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name. I'm very sorry if I butcher your name. Myron Jesperson. As much as we would love the party to be in power, we are not likely to see that in the near future, nor are we likely to hold the balance of power. Assuming that we have a few seats in the next parliament, what strategy do you pursue to make a difference in legislation on the critical issues you have identified?
Well, I think the 15 steps to 50 seats plan, which I laid out, is pretty solid. And I think we would need 18 months to 2 years to do it. I think that there's an election in 6 months or less than 12 months. It would be hard to do all the advanced organizing work that we would have to do. But if we have, 12, 18, 2 years, then I think we can get 50 seats. So I challenge the assumption because I think a 50 seat block is big enough to hold the balance of power, to be an overwhelming force in opposition. That is, I think, doable. I would do exactly what we did. So I wrote this whole piece called End Poverty Now with a 40-page costing document. I've sent it into Chrystia Freeland. Paul Manley, who I have huge respect for, has been an unqualified champion of it. Every single intervention he makes in the House. I mean, we all bring different skills to this. One of the skill sets I bring is I know how to write good legislation, and I understand budgets and taxation like few other people in the country do, just simply because I've occupied several cabinet positions in a large provincial government and been mayor of a large city. So I really get how you do the finance piece. So I've done that. So the Green Party could literally run on that. If you actually go and read the End Poverty Now, there's a document that explains exactly why this pays for itself with a positive overall impact on the economy with $18 billion in new provincial revenue. But if you're an Indigenous woman in Garden Hill, Manitoba, and you've got 3 kids, you can literally look in that document on page 16, I think it is. And on page 16, it says, this is what you currently get. You're currently 40% of the low income medium. If the Green Party is elected or can get this policy paid for, you actually are completely lifted out of poverty and you move into a remarkably high level of income compared to what you've ever experienced. You can afford childcare, you can do that. But if we do policy like that, where we actually put the document out, where someone in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, or Prince George, British Columbia can look at a document and they can exactly see that they're a personal support worker or they're a retail, in Vancouver, or a retail sales clerk in Regina, and they can exactly see what their income is going to be, then all of a sudden guaranteed livable income isn't just a theoretical thing that's going to make life better. Every single Canadian. And I did that document because that guaranteed livable income document, the End Poverty Now, to me is a campaign platform. I wrote it so that if 2 days after hopefully I'm elected your leader, we could put that out. C'est écrit en français, en anglais, dans les 2 langues officielles. C'est prêt, mise en place. It's ready to go and put in place in both official languages. The Liberals, we can actually attack the Liberals where we're going to actually put more money into social equity and more money into low income and middle income pockets without the massive debts that they're accumulating. What are the Tories going to say? The NDP have Motion 46 out there, which is the biggest utopian shopping list on a guaranteed livable income. That kind of smart, informed politics that's balanced, costed, that's transparent, you don't have 10 of them. You pick the ones that matter. Climate change is obviously one of them. Dealing with racism and systemic discrimination is another one. Guaranteed livable income is another one. And electoral reform. A lot of us voted Liberal basically because we thought we had this unqualified commitment to mixed members proportional representation. And Justin Trudeau lied to us 12 times. And we got to call him out on that. You know how many people out there are just tired of being lied to by Liberals? Completely frustrated by the racism and ignorance of conservatives, and you Democrats who promise you everything when they get in power deliver you almost nothing. Like, if we can't move ahead right now by just being darn honest with people, then we got a chance now, and we just got to stick to accuracy, fact-based policy, and keep it simple. We don't need to talk about Quebec separatism, and we don't need to talk about how we whip our vote. We need to talk about things that live in the middle of Canadians' lives. And if I'm your leader, I will deliver that kind of Green Party to you, which is what I think you want.
Great, Glenn. I'm just going to tell you that we are at about 11 minutes after 8 o'clock. I was trying to get in earlier, but
Sorry.
no, just so you know, you're still okay for some time?
I am. And if I sound a bit emotional and frustrated, you know, in the last week, I just looked at where our party is going. Canada is one of the only hopes to fight climate change. And this party can't declare war on mainstream labor. It can't exclude green tech businesses. It can't bring in issues that completely confuse and muddle our message. And no, I mean, we've all been singing, holding hands and singing Kumbaya, that we all have these, you know, 9 great candidates, and we do. They're all qualified. I don't agree with much that Dimitri says, but he's an intelligent, articulate man. But this isn't about us or our personalities. It's about the kind of party you want. And I don't think that a party, a Green Party that doesn't have a place for most of the people who are currently at the table is a Green Party that can deliver the change that we want. And I'm disappointed in our party leadership. A lot of the people that have been attacked have noticed that no one else is speaking out. No one else is speaking out except me. And I actually, I'll tell you, I phoned members of parliament. I phoned leading members of the party. And I said, you know, we're not having an honest debate about this. Do you want to be members of this bizarrely defined eco-socialist party? Or do you want to be a party based on global green values that has as much room for a Jim Harris and a Mike Schreiner and a Gord Miller and a Paul Manley as it has for a Dimitri Lascaris and a Miriam Haddad? I don't want to exclude anyone. I think the eco-socialist wing of the party is an important part of our debate and has a place at this party that the NDP couldn't even accommodate. Look at how the NDP treated the LEAP faction and Naomi Klein. I mean, these are supposed to be, I mean, they couldn't even find space for people who were only 1 degree away from them. And we're the party that isn't part of this culture polarization war where we all live in an echo chamber and only listen to people that agree with us. I mean, I've been in other political parties. I've seen that. We don't need more of that. We don't need more of that old hidebound, polarized ideological party. We need to be listening to each other. I have lots of time. I agree with a lot of things that Dimitri and Miriam say and argue. I mean, I think on probably guaranteed livable income, we'd all agree across the entire party. So why not start with what we have in common? We have lots of time to have good fights over our differences, but let's not tell labor leaders and businesses and parts of the community that there's not really a place for them, or that they can be open. You know, the way that Dimitri stood up on stage and attacked Erwin Kotler in a public meeting is not the kind of conduct that I think is appropriate for a leader in the party. And no one's calling him on it. I'm sorry, so someone has to. And I'm sorry it's come down to me, because why? Because, you know, it's not more important to me to get someone's vote on a second ballot than to be supporting a change in our party that I don't think serves us or our values or Canadians well. And I'm really making a plea to you to get more active. And if you haven't been paying attention to this, really take a second look at every single candidate and really ask yourself, what kind of party do you want to have on October 4th? Because it's a big choice.
We are keeping all these interviews that we're doing. They're all going to be available on the Nipper Greens YouTube site, so people will be able to take a look at this interview again and the other ones to make comparisons. My understanding is, Susan, that you had a question ready?
Yes, I have about 3 of them. So I'm gonna give Glenn his choice. Electoral reform, how you made it from the Liberals to the Greens, and how you see being leader of the Green Party when Elizabeth May said that the leader has no power. So your choice, whichever you'd like.
Let me answer them all really quickly. One, we have to win 50 seats under the existing system. We need someone who's gotten elected. I've gotten elected 8 times, 5 times with no party label as an out gay kid who ran a needle exchange program in downtown Winnipeg and was not exactly had the background to leap into a mayor's chair, never mind get elected by all the mayors. So follow that policy, that's it. What was well, you know, being a leader of the Green Party is someone with enormous responsibility and no authority. Can't make policy, get one vote at federal council, you know, everyone's gonna blame you if we bomb in an election. Poor Elizabeth, you know, has the weight of the world on her shoulders and very little authority to change anything. Matter of fact, I would like to see an entire review of our party structure. What is the authority and responsibility of our federal council? We ask a lot of EDAs and our volunteers. We don't give them much authority, and we give them these incredible mandate without the resources, and we don't seem to divide the revenues that go through it. Like our whole party has a complete disconnect. Now we have a very powerful caucus. We got great caucus members. I mean, we have 3 of the best MPs, Paul, Jenica, Elizabeth. What other team would you want to be on? These are broad-minded, inclusive, progressive, thoughtful, dynamic, dedicated, hardworking folks. I'm so enormously proud of them. We don't need to reorient our politics. We have 3 people who represent not just the Greens in their constituencies, but they're demonstrating they represent everyone in their constituencies. So, you know, for me, being party leader is like being a mayor of a large city. When I got elected mayor of Winnipeg, I was this gay kid. I was on the wrong side of politics. All of the old guard pro-development had 2/3 of council, and I had 1 vote. I had to be charming, smart, and have my facts. But I never lost a vote except once in my 2 terms as councilor. I won them over, and I have experience having been a mayor who has 1 vote, but is held. Not being a mayor of a large city is not that much different than being the leader of a party. I'm going into this with 1 vote, and I'm counting on my wits and my charm and all of you, and just being true to the commitments I'm making to you, so that you see me trying to work for you, trying to make sure that your voices are lifted up. This is too big a party with too much diversity of views, and we don't need to push out one set of ideas for another. But my job is going to be to lift up everyone's voice. Miriam's voice, Courtney's voice, Amita's voice, you know, Anna-Mee's voice, all of your voices. Like, you're an orchestra leader. My job is to enable a movement, not to try and speak for a big, complicated party, except when we have a platform and during an election when we have message discipline, because we're trying to explain to Canadians how we're going to do guaranteed livable income, or how we're going to get a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And when we're working with labor and business and community and civil society and community leaders, you got to have someone who can shake a hand and come to an agreement, that can work on behalf of the party. But that is a constant level of trust. So I think I answered all 3 of your questions, but my best case for doing it is it's been part of every job I've had in my life to this point. So I come to it with a pretty successful track record in managing those complicated relationships.
That's great. It was the other thing was about how you went from the Liberals to the Green Party.
Oh, I don't feel like it's changed. I was a member of a provincial party that fought and introduced the first basic guaranteed income in the country, that introduced the most aggressive climate change program and saw the greatest reductions, put a price on carbon, transformed to electric vehicles, introduced first zero waste circular economy, did groundbreaking work with Indigenous people on getting rid of mercury, phased out systemic neurotoxic pesticides for the first time, which was that. I mean, everything we were doing there. So I'm now agreed. What am I working on? Guaranteed livable income, 60% on that. Trying to build relationships with labor and business to get climate change, fighting against neurotoxic pesticides, trying to create a circular economy. And I mean, if I joined the Liberal Party, I'd be switching parties. I mean, for me, joining the Green Party was the logical extension. I wouldn't go back and join the Ontario Liberal Party. Stephen and the team there don't believe in this stuff. There's no one who's picked up the shovel on all the stuff I was working on. They're not that party. Party labels don't seem to, I mean, if you're in BC and you're a Liberal, a Christy Clark Liberal, you couldn't be a Kathleen Wynne Liberal. You know, Bob Ray was an NDP premier. He was a Liberal leader. Thomas Mulcair was a Liberal Quebec environment minister who was an NDP leader. I mean, I don't believe that parties actually stand for very much anymore, except for the Green Party. And that's why I think it's important that we're true to ourselves, that we actually think about when we vote for a leader. It's not about just voting for that person. It's our values. It's how we want to treat people. It's how we want to include people. It's what kind of people and what kind of party we are. You know, now Mike Schreiner's there. I wouldn't blink. Mike and I used to always joke that we have so little time in climate change. We have to elect a ton of Greens and we have to green the other parties. And I think, you know, when someone asked the question that we're probably not going to form a majority government in the next election. So we got to do that. We got to elect a ton of Greens, as many as we possibly can. And we got to force the greening of the other parties. That's the only way we're going to get there in time. You know, love to have majority government, but my mother taught me how guilt works really well, you know.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, super, Glenn. I think Travis has got another question from our participants.
Awesome. I have one here from Nicole Belle, and she is asking, will you run as a candidate if you don't win the leadership race?
Depends who the leader would be. If it was someone who represents the kind of values I think the Green Party stands for, unblinkingly. And maybe people don't want me to be a candidate. Maybe they want me to do organizational work and help get 50 people elected. I'm fine with that. I'll take direction from the party. I want to work as part of a team. I don't have any egos. My partner of 26 years as a gay couple, when Elizabeth came to talk to me about being a candidate and really asking me if I would run, my partner heard about it, and after 26 years as a gay couple in public life, and having been a single parent before that, the idea of going, I thought he'd be crazy. And he said to me, you got to do it. You need someone with your experience. We have a climate crisis. I will give you up for 5 or 10 years. At age 62, to give up time and life away from your family, when this was the decade that he and I, after all the public service that he and I did, because he served in the Canadian Armed Forces on the front lines, and we've both been really dedicated to public service. I never thought, but part of the reason I'm running this is because Rick looked at me and said, the stakes are too high. You're a granddad. You got to do this for our generation and for future generations. So yeah, I would run, but I don't have any, it's not about being leader of the party that is important to me. It's about how our party creates change. So I will work with the party, the Green Party anyway, but I can't work with a party that treats people who should be our natural allies as if they're enemies, and says things like, one leader, Dimitri, said, I will just dispense with Jerry Dias. Well, I've worked with Jerry Dias for almost 20 years. I will not dispense with Jerry Dias. I will work with Jerry. I will work closely with Jerry Dias and Unifor and Blue Green and on Just Tradition. And I will work with Dimitri Lascaris. I will work my ass off to work with him. But I will also be really clear that people who are on the Green team treat people with respect and don't attack people. And if we become a party that becomes that bitter and that negative, I don't think that I would have trouble. I would have trouble being a candidate in a party that treated people that I've worked with for years to create positive change on the environment and social justice in the way that some people might. I could not treat someone the way that Dimitri treated Erwin Kotler, and I could not treat someone the way that Dimitri speaks about Jerry Dias. These are very respectable Canadians who've done great service. You can disagree with them, but you don't treat them that way. And the fact that Dimitri is one of our leading candidates and may well win this, to me, I would have a great deal of trouble supporting a party that was led by anybody with that particular approach.
Thank you, Glenn. We're running out of time. I have one here that came in quickly from a participant. If you can do this in 2 minutes, what's your thoughts on defunding the police?
I think it's very bad language once you get outside of a certain bubble. But let me say something. When I was mayor of Winnipeg, the police budget was less than 20% of the budget. It was 16 or 18%. We didn't have helicopters. We didn't have surveillance policing. We had community-based policing. We had Indigenous community leadership. We sent police officers out with fire inspectors, building inspectors, housing inspectors, bylaw enforcement officers, local public health nurse, and a social worker, and they worked in every high needs community as a team, and the police were part of an integrated safety response. Today in Winnipeg, the police budget is well over 30%. It's like 33 or 34%, 15 years after I was mayor. I think that's outrageous. We don't need to be spending over a third of our tax dollars on policing when for most of the history of the city, we spent half of much of that. So it's not about defunding police, it's about normalizing policing services and realizing that safety isn't about cruiser cars responding. Safety is about safe, wonderful recreation programs, great parks, wonderful childcare, well-lit streets, healthy neighborhood main streets with patios, where there's lots of eyes on the streets, where libraries are open and communities are rich, where city planning is strong and transit buses run down well-lit streets, and people have a sense of respect and celebration of the diversity of their neighborhood. And more decisions are made in neighborhood councils and community development corporations where Indigenous people can express their rights and participate fully in the society and the community of the cities that creates it as safe. So I would say we have to go back to the future. The Toronto, where we had community-based planning initiatives and community-based planning offices in absolutely every community, and communities led their plan, are long gone. We have an overly centralized bureaucratic city government. We can actually, all of those programs that kept neighborhoods safe used to be 50% of the city budget when I was mayor. They're now 33%. So what I would do is I would restore all of those community programs, cultural programs, neighborhood safety programs back to 50%. And I would slowly work away from surveillance response policing and do grassroots community policing, which was the idea of our own police department, which is what most of our inner city communities want. The health department wants to be able to go back out into community. Building inspectors don't want to go down into dangerous neighborhoods without police officers, but just sending a police officer in when sometimes building code violations are the quickest way to clean up a drug house, and you can do it with a police officer because it's the fact that the building has bad wiring and is in code violation that allows the police to go and clean it up, because community-based policing is based on the principle that crime has an address. Response surveillance policing is that crime is a result of a phone call. And I will tell you that the systems where cities know and build a community-based policing where police are part of a neighborhood and they understand that you work on the addresses and the locations of crime and the geography of crime are much safer than surveillance, helicopter-based, ridiculous policing. And that's what's happened in Canada. So it's not just about defunding or refunding, it's reapportioning a coherent safety strategy and getting away from surveillance policing that doesn't work. It doesn't reduce crime. It doesn't help neighborhoods. It doesn't make people safer, and get back to community-based policing. And the federal government could play a major role doing that. But you know, I mentioned Heather Manley before. She was an OPP officer for 25 years. Ask her, she worked in northern communities. Just call the people together in your community. You would be surprised in the average, well, actually you guys would not be surprised, but my experience is in the average Green Party EDA, you've got the most interesting, complicated group of people that ever came together under one party, and they're more diverse and complicated than any other groups of human beings I've ever met. So I would just simply, have a coffee clutch and talk about community policing. You'd be surprised what you might find in your neighborhood. Okay. I love you guys very much. Wow. I'm very honored to be associated with you. And I don't want to push anyone out of this party, but I don't want people in the party who feel they can push other people out.
Thank you, Glenn. I'm sort of stuck for words here, but I really enjoyed your heartfelt answers and for the fact that you are running for the leadership